Hello and welcome back to another video. My name is Erica and today I will be sharing my December wrap-up. If you did watch my December TBR video or if you watched any of my December reading vlogs, then you may know that I originally had 12 books on my TBR for the month of December because I had decided to participate in the Merry Bookmas Readathon for 2020. And I will go ahead and just let you know that I did not read all 12. It was a very ambitious TBR for me, and I didn't read all of them, but that's totally fine. I did read 8 of them, which I still feel is a great number. So before I share with you the books that I did read, I will go ahead and just show you the books that I had on my TBR, but that I did not read. The first is The Promise, which is the first collection of comics in the Avatar: The Last Airbender comics series. Comfort and Joy by Kristen Hanna. A Darker Shade of Magic by V.E. Schwab, and if you've seen my January TBR, then you know that this one got pushed to my January TBR, so hopefully I will be reading this one in the month of January. We will see. And The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern, which I did start, but I did not finish. And this is another one that I am pushing into January, so hopefully I will read this one in the month of January. So those are the 4 that I did not fully get to, but the other 8 I did read and I did enjoy. So of the 8 that I read, I gave 4 books 5 stars. I gave 1 book 4 stars. I gave 2 books 3 stars. And I gave 1 book no stars, and I will kind of explain that when I get to that book. Also, of the 8 books that I read, 2 of them were fantasy, 2 of them were mystery thriller, 3 of them were romance, and 1 of them was a memoir. So I think for this video, I am going to talk about these based on genre, starting with my fantasy reads. And the first book I'm going to talk about is The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden. This was one of my 5-star reads. It was one that I read right at the beginning of the month for JD Ray Reads, Jade from JD Ray Reads mini Polarthon that she hosted at the beginning of December. And I can't really say that I have ever read a polar fantasy, I don't think. So this was kind of a first for me, and it was one that I was a little intimidated by just because I had heard so many people talk about how slow it was, and so I really thought that I was going to be like trudging through this, which meant that I may not like it as much. And I will admit that it was slow at the beginning, but the writing is so gorgeous. And like towards the middle and especially towards the end of this, I was just like totally hooked. I was so eager to see like what would happen and like how the book would end, and I just really loved it so much. And I am very excited that this is the first in a trilogy, which means that there are 2 more books in this series that I will get to read, so I am excited to get to those. I think if all goes to plan, I will save those other 2 for February, I think, because that is when Jade from JD Ray Reads is going to be hosting her like main Polarthon for the year, and so I think I'm going to save those and read those during that readathon. But basically this book is a polar fantasy because it takes place in a polar or wintry setting. Specifically, it takes place in medieval Russia and is based heavily on Russian folklore, I believe. It follows a girl named Vazia whose mother dies in childbirth, and years later her father remarries this devout Christian woman, and when she comes to live with them in their village, she brings with her like this priest, and that creates a lot of conflict because Vazia is very free-spirited. She has a lot of ties to their old religion, and specifically she has the ability to see like the spirits of their house and the spirits of the forest. So a lot of this book is really her sort of like discovering those powers and ultimately trying to use those powers to protect her village. It also talks about Frost, the blue-eyed winter demon, and I personally loved that element of the story, and I'm very curious to see how that plays into the other books in the series. I just loved how much this book really did feel like a fairy tale. It has this sort of like sweeping magic. It's very beautifully written. And overall, I loved it. And it was a great sort of start to my December. Okay, so the next fantasy that I read this month was A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas. And I know, based on some other booktube videos that I have watched about this series, this is either a series that people really like or a series that people really hate. Like they are either on the Sarah J. Maas train or they are not. And I am on the Sarah J. Maas train now. I gave this book 4 stars. It was very enjoyable. Like this is maybe a book that I would categorize as like a guilty pleasure because it was fun. Like it was super fun. And like I'm very excited to continue with the series. I will be reading the second book in January, by the way. But I can also recognize that this book is pretty flawed. Like I watched an entire rant review of this book, which I can link down below in the description, and I agreed with a lot of what she said. Like there are a lot of ways that this book is just not doing it right, like from a more critical standpoint. This book is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. It is a YA fantasy romance, although you could maybe categorize it as new adult because things get a little steamy. I have heard that the second book is very steamy. We're following the main character, Feyre, who at the beginning of the story accidentally kills a fairy, and she is given a choice to either be killed for her actions or to spend the rest of her days in what she believes is the like dangerous land of the Fae. Obviously she goes with the second option and she is taken by a fairy named Tamlin to his like court. There's obviously magic because it is a Beauty and the Beast retelling. There's obviously a curse that must be broken. And for me it was just a fun time. Like as I was reading this, it reminded me a lot of like Twilight, which is another series that like people either really love it or they really hate it. And this gave me a lot of like that young adult Twilight fantasy romance kind of vibe. And I gave it a 4 stars, so there you have it. Continuing with the romance that I read in the month of December, I'm going to talk about 2 books that were both 5-star reads for me. I absolutely loved both of these books, and that is Get a Life, Chloe Brown, and Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert. These books were fantastic. Honestly, I picked this book up earlier this year without realizing that it was a 2020 release, without realizing just how like hyped it was, how many people were reading it and loving it. And then I started seeing people talk about it on BookTube and I was like, oh my God, like I bought that book. I'm glad that I figured out that these went together and chose to read this one first. They do kind of go in order. The couple that gets together in this book is together and like comes back up in this book. So if you want like the story of how these two got together in order to understand them in this book, then, you know, I would read this one first and then read this one. However, I actually liked this one more than I liked this one. They were both great, both 5-star reads. I loved both of them so much, but this one I just liked a little bit more than I liked this one. So Get a Life Chloe Brown obviously follows Chloe Brown, who is a really fun character. She's kind of a nerdy girl. She's a homebody. She is Black. She is British. She is chronically ill, which is an element of the story that comes up a lot and I think is some good representation. Obviously, I can't speak to how accurately represented that was, but if that's something that you're looking for, that is included in this book. Towards the very beginning of the story, she's in like this near-death experience, which has nothing to do with her illness, but it makes her realize that like her life is not everything she wishes that it was. And so she decides to make this list, call her Get a Life list, where she is going to basically do all the things that she wants to do to make her life more interesting and to make her life more fun and to make herself more brave. More brave? Braver? Braver. To make herself braver. In the process of this, she meets Red, who's the superintendent of her building, and he is sort of perceived as like this bad boy motorcycle biker guy with like all these tattoos and things, but he's actually so sweet. He's this very sweet, creative artist. He's a painter. And she asks him to help fulfill some of the items on her list, and ultimately they fall for each other, and it is so sweet and it is so cute. I love like the balance of like sweet and steamy that this book has. Same with Take a Hint, Dani Brown. Like both of these have such like sweet, sentimental moments where you can tell that these characters really love each other and really care about each other and support each other. But like there's also really great sex. So again, this one was a 5-star read for me. And shortly after having read this one, I almost immediately jumped into Take a Hint, Dani Brown, which was also so good. Dani Brown is another great character. She is, I almost forgot her name. I almost said Talia's sister. That's the author. She's Chloe's sister. She's Black. She's British. She's bisexual. She's an academic. She's like a teacher at a university. She teaches literature courses. She's working towards her PhD. She is very driven. She just lives life unapologetically. And then she meets Zaf, who is like such an opposite to her character because he is so soft and so sweet. He is this ex-rugby player who is now working as a security guard in her building. He has a very traumatic past. He deals with anxiety, which again, I love that representation in this book. And he runs a youth program for boys called Tackle It, where yes, they obviously play rugby. He's an ex-rugby player, obviously. He has experience with that, but the other things that they are tackling are like how to deal with their emotions and acknowledge their emotions in a healthy way, which like I just love so freaking much. They are tackling toxic masculinity. And for a romance novel, I love how that is like brought up so much, especially because Zaf does deal with anxiety and he's very open about that and he talks about it, and Dani is very supportive of him in that, and he actually helps her to kind of acknowledge some of her feelings and allow herself to feel her feelings too, instead of being so against the idea of someone loving her. Oh, it's just so good. I loved it so much. Both of these, I love the relationships. I love the characters. I love that we get alternating perspectives. And I am so thrilled to read the third installment of this trilogy The third book is going to be Act Your Age, Eve Brown, I'm pretty sure is the title of that one. And Eve obviously is the third sister. And I love like how they are together as sisters also. Like they all appear in each other's stories, and that's just another wonderful element to these books. The last romance that I read this month, which was cute but not nearly as good as these other two, was In a Holidays by Christina Lauren. This was my first book by Christina Lauren. I do want to read more of their books. I just thought this one was okay. It follows May, and every year she and her family go on this like Christmas vacation to this cabin in Utah. It's her family and then like lots of other family friends that always get together this time of year. Ever since like they were kids, her family has done this. And now she's an adult, and the boys that she grew up with at the cabin are also now adults, and there's a bit of a love triangle that happens here. But really the main like element or like trope that's worth noting in this book is that it does include a time loop. So the book starts with her and her family like leaving the cabin at the end of their vacation together. She also just regrets some of the choices that she made over this particular vacation, and life for her in general is just like not going super awesome. So she makes a wish to the universe to like show her what will make her happy. And then that is when she's sent back in time to like relive this Christmas vacation over and over again until she, you know, comes to the conclusion of what will actually make her happy. And it's a romance, of course, so you can guess that that's going to be part of it. It was definitely cute, and it was a very like light, fun read for me personally over like actual Christmas was when I read this. I ended up giving this 3 stars. I don't know if I mentioned that yet. 3 stars. It was just okay. It wasn't anything like amazing to me, but it was cute. I enjoyed it. The only other 3-star read that I had this month was one of my mystery thrillers called The Lost Causes of Bleak Creek. And this one was my buddy read with my friend Taylor. And this was another one that was like, it was cute, it was fun, like we enjoyed reading it together, but overall it wasn't anything amazing to me. As a mystery thriller, I say it was cute because it follows like these 8th graders as the main characters, and they live in this like small southern town, and there's this guy in the community who runs like this reform school where all the bad kids get sent to get better essentially. However, there have been multiple deaths at this school like over the past decade, and for whatever reason like the community just accepts it for what it is. Of course, you realize as you read the story that like there's more to it and there's this mystery thing that's happening. There are definitely like cult vibes in this book. There are some supernatural elements. And honestly, I think the premise of this story was really cool, and I think that it had a lot of potential. The authors just didn't like go for it as hard as I think they could have. Like, I think that the story could have been drawn out a whole lot more, and I think things could have been made a lot darker than they were. Like, they definitely kept it very like YA, even though I do think it is categorized as an adult novel. So yeah, fun read, gave it 3 stars. The other thriller that I read in the month of December was a 5-star read for me, and that is The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides, I believe is how you pronounce that. If not, I'm so sorry. Please let me know how to pronounce that. I really enjoyed this book, obviously. This was another buddy read for me. I read this with my friend Leah, and it was interesting because the first half of this book is relatively slow, and like it took us a little bit to get through the first half. There was a lot of build up between the characters and sort of like setting up the tension. But then like the second half, we just flew through. Like literally, she and I talked about the first half of this book, And then the very next day we talked about the second half of this book because that is all it took for us to finish reading this. This book is about a woman who murders her husband and then goes silent and does not talk. She doesn't talk to her doctors, she doesn't talk to the police, and this lasts for years. She just ends up in this like psych ward, and nobody really knows the full story of like what or why things happened. Most of the story is actually told from the perspective of her psychotherapist, who gets a job where she is because he is specifically interested in her case and like wants to get to the bottom of what actually happened. And so we flip back and forth between his perspective and her old diary entries back from like before the murder actually happened. So it's weird because the whole first half of the book, there's like a lot of information that we're getting, even though it feels like there's not a lot happening. And then in the second half of the book, like everything just unravels and like I couldn't put it down. It's also crazy because I accidentally predicted the ending of this book. I was so sure that I hadn't actually predicted the ending that by the actual end, I was still shocked. There were a handful of twists at the end, and I just thought it was so good. And it was one of those where like you finished reading it and then you kind of want to go back and reread the whole thing to like piece together how it all actually happened. Now that you know how it ends, like I would be interested to go back and reread the first half. I just thought the way that the story unfolded was done so well, and I loved it. I gave it 5 stars. The last book that I read this month was a memoir called Born a Crime by Trevor Noah, and this is a book that I've had on my shelf for a while now, and I am so pleased that I finally gave myself an excuse to read this because it was so good. Trevor Noah is a comedian with such an interesting life story. He is from South Africa, and this memoir focuses so much less on his career in comedy and so much more on his experiences in South Africa during his childhood, which was also during apartheid. And so much of the stories that he includes throughout this book deal with the system of apartheid and how it impacted him and his family, how it impacted his ideas about money, poverty, family, race. It was so interesting. So like if you are a fan of Trevor Noah because of his comedy and you want to know more about his life, obviously I would recommend this. But if you are someone who's just interested in someone's experience of apartheid and like how that system worked, I think that this book is so illuminating, and for that reason I think it's really important. I didn't actually give this book a star rating, even though I would rate it pretty high, just because I have decided, like some other booktubers that I've watched, that I'm not going to rate memoirs. I just don't feel entirely comfortable like slapping a star rating on someone's life. You may or may not agree, and that's fine, and I may or may not change my mind about that in the future, but for now, for memoirs, I really do enjoy memoirs. I like reading memoirs. I just don't think I'm going to rate them. Regardless, I do highly recommend this book. If you are interested in which prompts for the Merry Bookmas Readathon I read each of these books for, I will go ahead and quickly review what those were. I read The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden for read a book with a bird, a fruit, or a tree on the cover. I read A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas for read a red book, or a book with the color red on the cover. I read Get a Life, Chloe Brown by Talia Hibbert for read a book with disability representation. And I read Take a Hint, Danny Brown for read a book featuring your favorite trope, which was fake dating. And I don't even think that I mentioned that before, but this book features fake dating and it is super cute. I read In a Holidays by Christina Lauren for Read a Romance, or a book featuring a friend group. Obviously, this is a romance. I read The Lost Causes of Bleak Creek for Buddy Read a Book, which was the book that I buddy read with my friend Taylor. I read The Silent Patient by Alex Michaelides for Read a Book that was released in 2019. And finally, I read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah for Read a Person. And finally, I read Born a Crime by Trevor Noah for Read a Book by or about a person of color. I don't have a physical copy of The Lost Causes of Bleak Creek anymore because I borrowed that book from Taylor, but other than that, these are all of the books that I read in the month of December. I'd say it was a pretty good month of reading. And that is it for this video. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you have also read any of these books that I read during the month of December, please feel free to let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Otherwise, I will see you guys in my next video. Bye guys.